The grand chamber of Catharos was a monument to silence. Its obsidian walls, polished to a mirror sheen, drank the light from the dying star that hung like a crimson wound in the planet's sky. Here, within the heart of the Draconian Imperium, silence was not an absence of sound but a presence, a form of pressure exerted by the weight of history and the gravity of power. High Lord Vorlag felt it pressing on the scales of his neck, a physical force that made each breath a conscious effort. He stood alone in the center of the vast, circular hall, his ceremonial armor feeling less like a symbol of his station and more like a cage of his own failure. Before him, elevated on a throne carved from the fossilized heart of a star leviathan, sat the Scale Mother, her form shrouded in shadows so deep they seemed to have substance. Her age was measured in epochs. Her thoughts were the slow, grinding tectonics of galactic policy. Around the chamber's circumference, in alcoves that were voids of deeper blackness, the other lords of the Cathar Imperium watched, their presence a collection of unseen, judging eyes. The subject of this silent censure was a star system designated Sol 3 and its primary world, a planet the primitives called Earth. A world that should have been a footnote in the glorious annals of the Imperium's expansion. A swift, clean conquest. A demonstration of dominion, the sacred creed that drove their race to bring order to the chaotic cosmos. Instead, it had become a source of profound, existential shame. The invasion fleet, a force of such overwhelming might that it had shattered entire federations and brought starfaring civilizations to their knees, now hung in silent, perpetual orbit around that primitive blue-green sphere. Not defeated, not damaged, simply still. A flotilla of ghosts crewed by the living dead. This was Vorlag's failure. He had been the fleet's commander. He had overseen the operation that had broken not the enemy, but his own warriors. The silence was finally broken by a voice that rasped like stone grinding against stone. Grand Marshal Kalen stepped from his alcove, his crimson armor a stark contrast to the chamber's gloom. He was Vorlag's political rival, a creature of pure, unadulterated Cathar ideology. "High Lord Vorlag," Kalen began, his voice devoid of honorific respect, "you have been silent for long enough. The Imperium demands an accounting. You were given a blade sharp enough to sever a galactic arm, and you used it to, what? Carve a monument to our own impotence. Explain. Explain why our finest warships, crewed by our most disciplined soldiers, have become nothing more than orbital debris around a mudball inhabited by pre-warp savages." Vorlag's gaze remained fixed on the shadowed throne. He would not give Kalen the satisfaction of a direct confrontation. He had replayed the events a million times in his mind, the sequence of actions that led not to a glorious victory or a noble defeat, but to this incomprehensible stasis. "The primitives offered no meaningful resistance," Vorlag said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled the chamber. "Our initial orbital bombardments were precise. Their infrastructure buckled as predicted. Their primitive projectile weapons were useless against our shields. Their fission-based explosives were trivial to neutralize. By every metric of Cathar military doctrine, the campaign was proceeding to a flawless conclusion within the first cycle." Kalen scoffed a harsh, guttural sound. "Flawless, your definition of the word is novel. The fleet remains, the planet remains, the primitives remain. My legions could have subjugated that world with their sidearms. This was a failure not of doctrine, but of will, your will, High Lord." "It was not a failure of will," Vorlag countered, a flicker of heat entering his tone. He finally turned to face his accuser. "It was a contamination, an anomaly for which our doctrines have no precedent." He remembered the moment everything changed. The initial chaos on the planet below had subsided. The primitives' feeble communication networks, which had been screaming with panic and disorganized military commands, fell silent. And then a new signal began to emanate from the planet's surface. It was not a weaponized frequency. It was not an attempt to jam their systems. It was a broadcast, omnidirectional, of staggering bandwidth and complexity. It was information. "A contamination," Kalen sneered, taking another step into the light. "Did these primitives unleash a plague, a biological agent that rendered our warriors inert?" "Of a kind," Vorlag admitted, the words tasting like ash. "But it was not biological. It was mimetic, informational. They did not attack our bodies. They attacked our concept of purpose." He recalled the first reports from his bridge officers. The sensor technicians, their eyes wide, their claws frozen above their consoles. They were monitoring the broadcast, trying to categorize it, but they had become transfixed. The signal was a deluge of the primitives' culture. Raw, unfiltered. Sounds they called music, a structured chaos of vibrations that evoked emotions for which the Cathar had no words. Visual streams of their art, from crude cave paintings to hyper-realistic digital renderings, depicting mythologies and histories of breathtaking complexity. And their stories, endless narratives of struggle, love, sacrifice, betrayal, and redemption. Tragedies that could shatter a warrior's heart, and comedies of such absurd joy they defied logic. Kalen threw his head back and laughed, a dry, rasping sound of utter disbelief. You are telling this council that the glorious Cathar fleet, the very fist of the Scale Mother, was defeated by pictures and noise, by the pathetic scrawlings of a lesser species. This is beyond cowardice, Vorlag. It is insanity. It was not its content alone, but its totality, Vorlag pressed, his voice rising with a desperate need to be understood. They sent everything. Their scientific formulae, from the simple physics of a lever to the esoteric mathematics of quantum mechanics. Their philosophical treatises, thousands of them, each contradicting the others, all exploring the meaning of existence from 1,000 different perspectives. They broadcast their history unedited. The wars, the genocides, the acts of breathtaking cruelty, and the moments of profound compassion and self-sacrifice that followed. They showed us their deepest shames and their greatest triumphs. It was the complete, raw, unvarnished soul of a species, laid bare for us to see. He remembered watching it himself in the privacy of his command chamber. A human composition, a symphony, filled the room. It was a wave of pure emotion, of sorrow and hope intertwined, a narrative told without a single word. He had felt a stirring within his own chest, an unfamiliar resonance that felt both alien and deeply, primordially familiar. It was the echo of an emotion his people had systematically purged from their genome over millennia. Empathy, a weakness. A flaw that hindered the righteous march of dominion. He had shut it off immediately, disturbed to his core. But his crews, they had not. They had listened. They had watched. Our warriors, Vorlag continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, are trained from birth in the certainty of the Cathar way. Dominion is the sole truth. Order is the sole virtue. Strength is the sole measure of worth. We are taught to see the universe as a chaotic canvas upon which we must impose our perfect design. But this broadcast, it did not argue with our philosophy. It simply presented an alternative. It showed them a species that embraces chaos. A species that finds strength in its own weakness, that creates beauty from its own pain. It introduced a paradox into the minds of our soldiers. How can you righteously extinguish a species that, in its own flawed, chaotic way, possesses such a profound and vibrant will to exist? The chamber was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of judgment, but of deep, unsettling contemplation. Even Kalen seemed momentarily lost for words. The other lords, hidden in their alcoves, were surely processing the sheer alien nature of this concept. Defeat not by force, but by perspective. Vorlag gestured with a clawed hand towards the imagined space where Earth hung. The first to fall were the intelligence analysts and linguists, their minds directly interfaced with the data stream. They simply stopped working. We found them at their stations, their eyes looking at their screens but seeing something far away. They would not respond to orders. They would not eat. They would only watch and listen. Then it spread to the rest of the crews. The pilots watching the blue world turn below, the gunnery officers in their fire control centers, the legionnaires in their barracks. They began to talk amongst themselves, debating the ethics of their mission. They questioned the very meaning of dominion. They were not mutinous. They were contemplative, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming burden of conscience. Conscience is a disease of the weak, Kalen spat, recovering his composure. A fiction used by lesser races to justify their own failures. You should have ordered the fleet to open fire. You should have cleansed the planet with fusion fire from orbit, jammed their pathetic signals, and completed the mission. I gave that order, Grand Marshal, Vorlag said, the memory a fresh wound. I commanded the fleet to initiate planetary sterilization protocol. The response I received from every capital ship, every cruiser, every frigate was the same. He paused, the words catching in his throat. It was a single unified transmission sent without encryption, a line from one of the primitives' own philosophical texts translated into our tongue. We can no longer be the instruments of it. Erpos we do not comprehend. The weight of that statement settled upon the chamber like a shroud, a fleet-wide, simultaneous, and peaceful refusal of a direct order from a high lord. It was not just mutiny, it was apostasy. It was the complete collapse of the Cathar military structure. The soldiers had not turned their weapons on their commanders. They had simply laid them down. They had chosen to become observers rather than destroyers. We sent recovery vessels, Vorlag continued, his voice heavy with the finality of it all. Crews shielded from the broadcast, tasked with boarding our ships, arresting the command staff, and taking control. But the moment they entered the system, the moment they saw that blue marble hanging in the void, with our own silent fleet arrayed around it like a crown of thorns, they too fell silent. Their mission commanders reported a profound sense of stillness, an unwillingness to disturb what they called a sacred vigil. The crews of the recovery ships joined the watch. The infection, this philosophy of inaction, had spread. And so the fleet remained, a permanent, silent memorial to a war that was lost without a single shot being fired in return. The ships were fully operational. The life support systems were functioning. The crews were alive, but they were no longer Cathar soldiers. They were something else entirely. Monks, philosophers, guardians of a thing they had been sent to destroy. They stayed in orbit forever, not because they were trapped, but because they had chosen to. "This is your report." Kalen's voice was dangerously low. "A fairy tale of sentient songs and poetic soldiers. You expect the Scale Mother to accept this explanation for the greatest military disgrace in the history of the Imperium." Vorlag stood straight, his imposing frame casting a long shadow in the dim light. "I expect nothing. I have reported the truth as I witnessed it. It is a truth our logic cannot easily process. We came to conquer a primitive world, and instead, we encountered an idea more powerful than our entire armada. We have always believed that the ultimate power in the universe is the ability to impose one's will upon others. The humans have shown us a different kind of power, the ability to compel others to question their own will. I do not have a military solution for this, Grand Marshal. I am not even certain it is a problem that can be solved with force." For the first time, a sound emanated from the throne, a soft, slow hiss like the shifting of ancient sands. The Scale Mother was stirring. The shadows around her seemed to deepen, and a palpable wave of psychic pressure rolled through the chamber. Kalen immediately fell silent, bowing his head in deference. Vorlag held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The fate of his world, of his entire species' philosophy, might be decided in the next moment. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all, a pregnant void in which a new future, or a final, bloody end for the primitives of Earth, would be conceived. The ancient mind on the throne was contemplating the unthinkable, a challenge not to the Imperium's borders but to its very soul. And the silent fleet in orbit around Earth was the evidence, a testament to a power so subtle and so profound that it had achieved what no military force ever had. It had made the Draconian Imperium pause. Weeks passed in a state of suspended animation for the Cathar Imperium. The Sol system anomaly was now a forbidden topic, a wound too fresh and too strange to be discussed openly. Grand Marshal Kalen pushed for a military resolution, advocating for the development of long-range, automated weapons that could scour the planet from outside the system's contaminating influence, manned by drone intelligences immune to philosophical plagues. But the Scale Mother remained silent, her judgment held in reserve, a terrifying ambiguity that left the entire political structure of the Imperium in a state of paralysis. High Lord Vorlag was confined to his estates, a pariah in all but name, left to endlessly contemplate the data logs from the failed invasion, searching for a logical flaw, a trick, a piece of alien subterfuge he had missed. He found nothing but the same maddening truth. The human broadcast, the chorus of humanity as his analysts had dubbed it, was not a weapon. It was an offering, a gift of self-knowledge so potent it had shattered the recipients. Then the second impossibility occurred. A signal was received from the Sol system. It was not the chaotic, overwhelming chorus, but a single, focused beam of communication directed precisely at Catharos. It was transmitted on a frequency used for galactic diplomacy, a protocol so ancient that the Cathar had not used it in millennia, since the last of the peer civilizations had been absorbed into their dominion. The message was simple, translated perfectly into the high formal dialect of the Cathar court. It was an invitati. On, the humans wished to speak. The audacity of it was breathtaking. The primitives, the intended subjects of conquest, were now initiating diplomatic contact as equals. Kalen was apoplectic. He saw it as a final insult, a mockery of their power. He argued before the council that the only appropriate response was a sterilized beam of exotic particles aimed at the signal's origin. To engage in dialogue would be to legitimize their defiance, to admit that their mimetic attack had succeeded. But again, the Scale Mother's will was inscrutable. A single command was issued from the throne, transmitted through her chamberlains. High Lord Vorlag would be the one to answer the call. He was the only one who had direct experience with the anomaly. He was to be their envoy. Vorlag received the command with a sense of grim finality. He was being sent back into the heart of his own failure to confront the architects of his disgrace. He was escorted to the deepest level of the Citadel, to a communication chamber that had not been used since the days of the old empire. It was a sphere of perfect darkness and silence, designed to filter out all external interference. A single holographic projector stood in the center. Here, he would meet the voice of humanity. As he stepped onto the platform, he felt the cold certainty that he was not just an envoy for his people, but a subject in an ongoing experiment. The connection was established. The air in front of him shimmered and a form coalesced. It was a human, a female of the species, her features delicate yet etched with a profound sense of calm. She was not old, but her eyes held a weariness that seemed ancient. She wore simple, unadorned gray robes, a stark contrast to his own ornate militaristic armor. She was not flanked by guards or advisors. She was alone, projecting an aura of quiet authority that was utterly alien to the Cathar concept of power, which was always demonstrated, never merely possessed. "High Lord Vorlag," she began, her voice calm and measured, the Cathar words pronounced with flawless precision. "I am Ambassador Eva Rostova. On behalf of the unified peoples of Earth, I thank you for accepting this communication." Vorlag found himself momentarily unable to speak. He had expected arrogance or fear or perhaps a triumphant gloating. He was met instead with a serene, almost somber politeness. "You are the one responsible for the signal," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Our species is responsible," she corrected gently. "I am merely a voice chosen to articulate our actions. We understand this must be a confusing time for your people. It was a desperate act, born of a situation for which we had no other answer." "You call it a desperate act," Vorlag countered, finding his footing. "Our Grand Marshal calls it an act of war, a mimetic attack that has neutralized a significant portion of our military strength." Rostova's expression shifted slightly, a subtle downturn of her lips that might have been sadness. "We understand why you would perceive it as an attack. Your species processes the universe through a lens of conflict and dominance. You came to us with weapons, so you expected a weapon in return, but the chorus was not a weapon. It was a mirror. We did not have the means to fight your fleet, so we chose to show you who it was you had come to destroy." The simplicity and sheer alien logic of her statement struck Vorlag with the force of a physical blow. A mirror, not a sword. "Explain," he commanded, though the word felt hollow. He was no longer in a position to command anything. "Our historical records, our art, our science, they all point to a singular, paradoxical truth about our species, High Lord," Rostova explained, her hands clasped calmly before her. "We are capable of the most astonishing cruelty, yet we are also capable of boundless empathy. We have an infinite capacity for self-destruction, yet we cherish life with a ferocity that defies logic. We are a species defined by our contradictions. We knew that any conventional defense would only result in our annihilation and reinforce your belief in your own superiority. So we offered the only thing of value we possessed, our truth, the totality of our experience. We gambled that a civilization capable of crossing the stars must, somewhere in its ancient past, have possessed the same contradictions, that the capacity for empathy, for wonder, for sorrow could not be entirely purged, that it could only be suppressed." Vorlag thought of the symphony he had heard, the feeling it had stirred in him, a resonance, a memory of something long lost. "Your soldiers," Rostova continued, her gaze unwavering, "are bred for certainty. Their minds are honed for a single purpose, the imposition of order. We flooded those minds with the glorious, terrible, beautiful chaos of human existence. We showed them paintings of a mother grieving for her child. We played them music composed in the depths of despair that somehow created hope. We transmitted stories of enemies who became brothers, of leaders who sacrificed themselves for their people, of scientists who dedicated their lives to understanding a single, tiny corner of the universe, for no other reason than the joy of knowing. We gave them the unfiltered, emotional, and philosophical context of our lives." "You broke them," Vorlag stated, the accusation flat and heavy. "No," she replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "We did not break them. We woke them. We presented them with a reality that their philosophy had not prepared them for. The reality that a thing does not have to be orderly to have value, that a species does not have to be strong to be worthy of existence. The cognitive dissonance was too great. The imperative to destroy came into direct conflict with a newfound, undeniable appreciation for the thing they were meant to destroy. Their wills did not shatter. They simply expanded. They could no longer find it in themselves to serve a purpose that demanded they extinguish such a potential for both horror and beauty. They chose to bear witness instead. The full horrifying scale of the human strategy was finally laid bare. It was not a weapon of war. It was an act of profound, aggressive empathy. They had not sought to kill the Cathar soldiers, but to convert them, to force them to see the universe not as a thing to be conquered, but as a thing to be experienced. For a species like the Cathar, whose entire civilization was built on the foundation of a single, unyielding ideology, this was a more terrifying prospect than any superweapon. It was the introduction of doubt. "And the fleet?" Vorlag asked, his voice low. "Why do they remain? Why do they stay in orbit forever?" "Because that is their choice," Rostova answered. "We have not trapped them. We have sent them communications offering to help them return home if they wish. They have refused. They see themselves now as guardians, a silent memorial. They are a reminder to both our species of what happened here. A testament to the day an invasion was met not with violence but with understanding. To move them would be to erase that lesson. They are no longer your soldiers, High Lord. They are the first Cathar philosophers. Their vigil is their sacred text." Vorlag felt a cold dread mix with a strange, unwelcome flicker of admiration. These primitives, these soft-skinned, illogical, emotional beings, had outmaneuvered the Cathar Imperium on a strategic level so profound that his people hadn't even known they were on the battlefield. They had not fought for territory, but for the very definition of truth. And they had won. "What do you want from us now?" Vorlag asked, the question one of genuine, desperate curiosity. "You have humbled us. You have taken our fleet. What are your terms?" Rostova's expression softened further. "We have no terms. We do not want tribute or territory or vengeance. That is your way, not ours. We want what we have wanted from the beginning, to be left alone to continue our chaotic, flawed, beautiful existence. But your arrival has changed things. We now know we are not alone, and you now know that power comes in forms you had not considered. We believe this new knowledge creates not an impasse, but an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" "For dialogue," she said simply. "Your fleet remains in our sky, a permanent reminder of our encounter. We can either view it as a symbol of your failure and our defiance, or we can see it as the foundation of a bridge between two profoundly different ways of seeing the universe. We do not wish to be your enemy, High Lord Vorlag. We do not wish to be your subjects either. We wish to know you." The conversation continued for hours. Vorlag, the hardened Cathar commander, found himself engaged in a philosophical discourse that stretched his mind to its breaking point. Rostova explained the human concepts of individuality, of rights, of art as a means of processing trauma, of science as an act of worshipful curiosity. She did not preach, she simply explained. For his part, Vorlag explained the Cathar concept of dominion, not as a drive for conquest, but as a deeply held belief in order as the ultimate cosmic good, a bulwark against the entropy and decay that would eventually consume all things. For the first time, he articulated his people's deepest fears, not to a subordinate or a rival, but to an outsider who listened with genuine, unnerving interest. When the transmission finally ended, the holographic image of Eva Rostova fading to leave him alone in the darkness, Vorlag felt utterly changed. The certainty that had been the bedrock of his existence was gone, replaced by a vast, terrifying, and strangely exhilarating expanse of questions. He had been sent to parley with the enemy and had instead found a teacher. He now had to return to the Grand Chamber, to the Scale Mother and the furious Grand Marshal, and deliver a report that would not only explain the fate of the fleet, but challenge the very future of the Cathar Imperium. He had to tell them that their ships would indeed stay in orbit forever, not as a prison, but as a classroom, and that their first lesson, taught by a species they had dismissed as primitives, was humility. High Lord Vorlag's return to the Grand Chamber was met with the same oppressive silence, but this time it was tinged with a palpable anticipation. His lengthy communion with the human ambassador had been monitored, the raw data fed directly to the Silent Throne and the Listening Council. They had heard every word, every alien concept, every profound challenge to their way of life. Vorlag walked to the center of the hall not as a failed commander, but as a witness to a new and terrifying truth. Grand Marshal Kalen was the first to speak, his voice a low growl of pure fury. He did not even bother with honorifics. "Vorlag, you have communed with the enemy. You have listened to their poison. I have seen the transcripts. They speak of empathy, of chaos, of worthiness in weakness. These are not concepts for dialogue. They are weapons of ideological corruption, and you have willingly exposed yourself to them. You are a traitor to the principle of dominion." "I am a servant of the Imperium," Vorlag replied, his voice steady, imbued with a newfound and unsettling calm. And the Imperium cannot be served by clinging to a doctrine that has been proven insufficient. The humans did not use a weapon. They used a truth, and a truth cannot be defeated by force, only by a greater truth. We do not possess one. Heresy, Kalen roared, his claws extending. The truth of dominion is absolute. The universe is chaotic, and we are its rightful gardeners. We pull the weeds. That is our purpose. That is our glory. This species is the most insidious weed we have ever encountered, one that convinces the gardener to lay down his tools and admire its chaotic growth. The only solution is fire. We must build the automated fleets. We must sterilize the planet from a distance. We must erase this philosophical contagion from the galaxy before it spreads. And what then, Kalen? Vorlag asked, his voice resonating with the quiet authority he had heard from the human ambassador. We burn their world and their truth with it, but the memory will remain. Our own soldiers, our own fleet, will stand as eternal witnesses against us. What happens when the next species we encounter has learned of this? What if they, too, greet us not with weapons, but with their own chorus? Will we spend the rest of eternity burning every world that shows us a reflection we do not like? Our empire will be built on a foundation of galactic ash, and we will be utterly alone, terrified of the slightest echo of a new idea. That is not dominion. That is fear. Kalen was about to retort, his entire body trembling with rage, but a slow, powerful hiss from the throne froze the word in his throat. The shadows around the Scale Mother swirled, and for the first time in a generation she moved. Her ancient, colossal head, scaled in patterns like a galactic nebula, leaned forward into the faint crimson light. Her eyes, vast and obsidian, containing the coldness of interstellar space, fixed upon the two lords. When she spoke, her voice was not a sound, but a telepathic wave that washed over them. A pressure of immense age and wisdom that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones. There is a flaw in our logic. The thought echoed in the mind of every Cathar in the chamber. We have sought to perfect our society by purging all weakness, all sentiment, all chaos. We have become a blade, perfectly honed, perfectly sharp. But a blade that encounters something it cannot cut does not have the option of becoming something else. It can only break. The Scale Mother's gaze shifted to Kalen. You advocate for a harder strike, Grand Marshal. You believe that if the blade fails, it is because it was not swung with sufficient force. You are wrong. To do so would be to shatter ourselves against an idea. Her gaze then fell upon Vorlag. And you, High Lord, you have looked into the mirror the primitives held up, and you have not flinched. You have accepted the possibility that our perfection is, in fact, an evolutionary dead end. You have shown the capacity to learn. This is a quality we have long neglected. A final, decisive thought washed through the chamber, carrying the weight of an imperial decree that would reshape their civilization. The fleet will remain. The vigil will be honored. The system of Sol will be designated a zone of contemplation. We will not conquer it. We will not destroy it. We will listen. High Lord Vorlag, you will be our first emissary. You will establish a permanent dialogue with this species. You will learn everything you can about their way of thinking. You will be the bridge between the way of the blade and the W. Eye of the mirror, this is the will of the Imperium. Kalen stood in stunned, horrified silence. It was a complete repudiation of everything he and the Imperium had stood for. Vorlag bowed his head, a gesture not of submission but of solemn acceptance. He felt not triumph, but the immense, crushing weight of his new responsibility. He was to guide his people into a new age, an age of uncertainty and introspection. In the cycles that followed, a strange and cautious relationship began to form. Vorlag, acting as emissary, engaged in continuous dialogue with Ambassador Rostova and a council of human thinkers. They established a joint scientific and philosophical outpost on Luna, Earth's moon, a neutral ground where the two species could interact and study one another. The Cathar, with their rigid logic and vast knowledge of galactic physics, were astounded by humanity's intuitive leaps, their creativity, their ability to hold a dozen contradictory ideas in their minds at once. Humans, in turn, were fascinated by the Cathar's deep sense of history, their unwavering discipline, and the profound, almost spiritual weight they gave to the concept of purpose. It was during one of these joint research sessions that the final, universe-altering twist was revealed. The Cathar had shared their complete sensor logs from the initial invasion. They had been analyzed by Cathar military technicians 1,000 times, searching for anomalies for hidden weapons. They had found nothing, but human scientists, looking at the same data with a different perspective, saw something else. They were not looking for a weapon. They were looking for patterns. Rostova summoned Vorlag to the lunar outpost with an urgency that was uncharacteristic for her. She led him to an observation dome, the blue and white swirl of Earth hanging above them, flanked by the distant, silent jewels of the Cathar fleet. In the center of the dome was a holographic display, showing a complex waveform analysis of the cosmic microwave background radiation in the Sol sector. "When your fleet first arrived," Rostova began, her voice low and serious, "your long-range sensors performed a deep background scan of the system, standard procedure to detect any hidden outposts or cloaked vessels. Your analysts dismissed the results as baseline radiation, cosmic noise, and it is, almost." She manipulated the display. The chaotic waveform resolved into a breathtakingly faint, but undeniably structured, repeating signal. It was a pattern of such immense wavelength and low energy that it was almost perfectly camouflaged by the leftover energy of the universe's creation. "This signal is old, High Lord. So old it makes your Imperium seem like a fleeting thought. We believe it has been broadcasting since before our planet's life had even crawled out of the oceans." Vorlag studied the signal, his tactician's mind immediately recognizing the non-random nature of the pattern. "A signal? From whom? We have mapped this entire galactic arm. There are no civilizations of that age." "We do not think it is from our galaxy," Rostova said, her eyes fixed on the display. "And here is the part that you missed, the part that changes everything." She overlaid a second waveform on the display. It was the energy signature of the chorus of humanity during the first hours of its broadcast. For a brief infinitesimal moment where the two signals intersected, the ancient signal showed a fractional but measurable spike in amplitude. Our broadcast resonated with it. It was like shouting in a cave and hearing a specific echo, an echo that shouldn't be there. Our chaotic, emotional, biological signal somehow acted as an amplifier or a key for this ancient, mathematical one. A cold dread, far deeper than any he had felt in the Grand Chamber, began to pool in Vorlag's gut. What did it say? The amplified signal. "It was not a message in a language we can understand," Rostova said, her face grim. "It was a burst of pure data, coordinates, a location outside the known galactic plane in the deep, empty void between galaxies, and a single repeating concept transmitted not as language but as pure mathematics, a warning." She brought up a final image on the display. It was a complex equation, a model of galactic decay and energy states. Vorlag, though not a theoretical physicist, understood enough to grasp the terrifying implications. The equation did not model a natural process. It modeled a harvest, a systematic, efficient, and impossibly vast process of energy extraction from entire galaxies. The truth fell into place with the chilling finality of a tomb door swinging shut. The ancient signal was not a greeting. It was a tripwire, a silent, patient alarm system left behind by a long-dead civilization. And humanity, in its desperate act of self-preservation, had just tripped it. The chorus, intended to save their world, had inadvertently announced their presence to something incomprehensible. Vast and ancient, something that consumed galaxies. The reason the galaxy was so empty of ancient, peer-level civilizations, a question that had always haunted Cathar historians, was suddenly answered with horrifying clarity. They weren't gone. They were consumed. Vorlag looked up from the display past the dome to the silent fleet hanging in the void. His ships, the monument to his failure, to his people's hubris. He looked at the Earth, the planet of poets and madmen who had defeated his legions with a song. They were no longer victor and vanquished. They were two species, standing on the shore of a dark and terrible ocean, having just thrown a stone into its depths. And now something was stirring. The Draconian invasion had hit primitive Earth, and their ships would stay in orbit forever. But they were no longer a symbol of a war that had ended. They were the first watchtowers in a new war that was just beginning. They were the silent, eternal guardians at the edge of a new and terrifying frontier, shared by two species who had been forced, by a truth greater than either of them, into a unity born of profound and absolute fear. The silence in the void was no longer empty. It was listening.